Tibet's recorded history begins in the 7th century with the emergence of the Tibetan Empire under King Songtsen Gampo. This period marked Tibet's transformation from a collection of nomadic tribes into a unified kingdom that would become one of Asia's most powerful empires. Songtsen Gampo, considered the first of Tibet's 3 Dharma kings, established the capital at Lhasa and created the foundation for Tibetan civilization. The king's most significant achievement was commissioning the creation of the Tibetan script by his minister Thonmi Sambodha, who adapted it from an Indian script. This development enabled the translation of Buddhist texts and the recording of Tibetan culture, laws, and history. Songtsen Gampo also married Princess Wencheng of Tang China and Princess Brikuti of Nepal, political alliances that introduced Buddhism to Tibet and established Tibet as a major regional power. Under subsequent rulers, particularly during the reign of Trisong Detsen, the Tibetan Empire reached its zenith. The empire stretched from the Tarim Basin in the north to parts of northern India in the south, and from present-day Afghanistan in the west to areas of China in the east. Tibetan armies even briefly occupied the Chinese capital of Chang'an in 763 CE, demonstrating the empire's military prowess. The introduction of Buddhism during this period was not without resistance. The indigenous Bon religion, with its shamanistic practices and nature worship, competed with the new faith. However, Buddhism gradually gained prominence, especially after the famous debate at Sami Monastery between Indian and Chinese Buddhist schools, which resulted in the adoption of Indian Buddhist traditions. The Tibetan Empire collapsed in the 9th century following the assassination of the anti-Buddhist king Langdarma in 842 CE. This event ushered in a period of political fragmentation that lasted for several centuries. However, this fragmentation paradoxically led to a renaissance of Buddhist culture known as the Second Diffusion of Buddhism. During this period, numerous Buddhist schools emerged, each with distinct philosophical approaches and practices. The Nyingma school, tracing its origins to Padmasambhava, preserved the old tantric traditions. The Kagyu school, founded by Marpa the translator, emphasized meditation practices and produced famous yogis like Milarepa. The Sakya school developed sophisticated philosophical systems, while the Gelug school, founded by Je Tsongkhapa, would eventually become the dominant tradition. This era saw the construction of major monasteries that became centers of learning, art, and political power. Monasteries like Sami, Teshulhunpo, and later Drepung and Sera housed thousands of monks and became repositories of Buddhist knowledge. The development of a unique Tibetan Buddhist culture during this period involved the translation of the entire Buddhist canon into Tibetan, creating one of the world's most complete collections of Buddhist literature. The 5th-10th century marked the beginning of the Dalai Lama institution, which would become central to Tibetan identity and governance. The first Dalai Lama, Gendon Drub, was a disciple of Je Tsongkhapa and founded Tashilhunpo Monastery. However, it was the 3rd Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, who first received the title Dalai Lama from the Mongol leader, Altan Khan. The relationship with Mongolia proved crucial for Tibet's development. The Mongols, who had converted to Tibetan Buddhism, provided military support that helped establish Gelug dominance. The Great Fifth Dalai Lama, Lobsang Gyatso, utilized this Mongol backing to unify Tibet under Gelug rule, effectively ending the political fragmentation that had lasted for centuries. The 5th Dalai Lama's reign represents a golden age of Tibetan culture and politics. He constructed the magnificent Potala Palace, which became the symbol of Tibetan Buddhism and the seat of the Dalai Lama as temporal and spiritual authority. His government, known as the Ganden Phadrang, established a unique form of theocratic rule that combined religious and secular authority. During this period, Tibet developed its distinctive cultural identity, blending Buddhist philosophy with traditional Tibetan customs. The concept of the Dalai Lama as both a spiritual leader and temporal ruler became deeply embedded in Tibetan consciousness. The institution of Tulku provided continuity of leadership and reinforced the Buddhist worldview and governance. The 18th century brought significant changes to Tibet's political landscape with the intervention of the Qing dynasty. Following internal conflicts and Mongol invasions, the Qing Emperor Kangxi sent troops to Tibet in 1720, establishing a Chinese protectorate over the region. This marked the beginning of a complex relationship between Tibet and China that would persist for centuries. Under Qing rule, Tibet maintained considerable autonomy. The Dalai Lama retained spiritual authority and significant temporal power, while Chinese ambans oversaw certain administrative functions. The Qing established the system of confirming the selection of high lamas, including the Dalai Lama, through a lottery system using a golden urn, though this was not always strictly enforced. The 19th century saw Tibet increasingly isolated from the outside world. The Tibetan government, wary of foreign influence, restricted trade and travel, earning Tibet the nickname the Forbidden Kingdom. This isolationist policy, while preserving traditional culture, also limited Tibet's ability to modernize and adapt to changing global circumstances. During this period, Tibetan society remained largely feudal, with a hierarchical system dominated by aristocratic families and monastic institutions. The majority of the population were peasants bound to the land, though the system was complex and varied across different regions. Monasteries controlled significant wealth and land, and monks played crucial roles in education, administration, and cultural preservation. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought Tibet into the sphere of the great game between British India and Russian expansion. The British, concerned about Russian influence in Central Asia, sought to establish diplomatic relations with Tibet. This led to the controversial Young Husband Expedition of 1903–1904, during which British forces invaded Tibet and forced the signing of the Convention of Lhasa. The 13th Dalai Lama, Thupten Gyatso, emerged as a reformist leader who recognized the need for modernization. He implemented various reforms, including the establishment of a modern army, currency system, and postal service. He also sent Tibetan students abroad for education and attempted to balance Tibet's relationships with China, Britain, and other powers. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 provided Tibet with an opportunity to assert its independence. The 13th Dalai Lama expelled Chinese forces and declared Tibet's independence in 1913. The Simla Convention of 1914 between Britain, China, and Tibet attempted to define Tibet's status, but China's refusal to ratify the agreement left Tibet's international position ambiguous. During this period, Tibet faced the challenge of modernization while preserving its unique cultural and religious identity. The 13th Dalai Lama's reforms met with resistance from conservative elements within Tibetan society, highlighting the tension between tradition and progress that would continue to characterize Tibet's development. The establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 dramatically altered Tibet's fate. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet, quickly overwhelming the small Tibetan army. The 17-point agreement signed in 1951 between China and Tibet promised autonomy while acknowledging Chinese sovereignty, but this agreement was signed under duress and its terms were gradually violated. The young 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, assumed full political power in 1950 at age 15, facing the unprecedented challenge of preserving Tibetan autonomy under Chinese rule. Initially, there were attempts at cooperation, with the Dalai Lama even traveling to Beijing in 1954–1955 to meet with Chinese leaders including Mao Zedong. However, Chinese policies increasingly undermined Tibetan autonomy. Land reforms, attacks on monasteries, and the imposition of communist ideology created widespread resentment. The situation deteriorated rapidly in the late 1950s as Chinese control tightened and traditional Tibetan institutions came under direct assault. The tensions culminated in the Tibetan Uprising of March 10, 1959, when tens of thousands of Tibetans surrounded the Norbalinka Palace to protect the Dalai Lama from what they believed was a Chinese plot to abduct him. The uprising was brutally suppressed by Chinese forces, leading to thousands of deaths and the Dalai Lama's escape to India. On March 17, 1959, the Dalai Lama's escape to India marked the beginning of the Tibetan exile community and a new chapter in Tibetan history. India granted asylum to the Dalai Lama and approximately 80,000 Tibetan refugees, establishing settlements in various parts of the country. Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh became the seat of the Tibetan government in exile. Meanwhile, Tibet under Chinese rule experienced devastating changes. The Cultural Revolution was particularly destructive, with thousands of monasteries destroyed and countless religious artifacts lost. Traditional Tibetan culture was suppressed as feudal and backward, while Chinese settlement in Tibet increased dramatically, altering the demographic composition of the region. The exile community faced the enormous challenge of preserving Tibetan culture and identity while adapting to life in a foreign environment. Under the Dalai Lama's leadership, they established schools, monasteries, and cultural institutions. The Tibetan government in exile, while not internationally recognized, worked to maintain Tibetan political traditions and advocate for Tibet's cause globally. The Dalai Lama's approach during this period evolved from seeking independence to advocating for genuine autonomy within China, a position that would later be formalized as the Middle Way approach. His emphasis on nonviolence and compassion, even toward the Chinese occupiers, earned him international respect and the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. The 1980s brought relative liberalization to Tibet under Tids in 1989. The 1980s brought relative liberalization to Tibet under liberalization to Tibet under Dia, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. Some restrictions on religious practice were lifted, damaged monasteries were rebuilt, and Tibetan culture began to experience a revival. However, this period also saw continued Chinese settlement and economic development that many Tibetans viewed as cultural imperialism. The late 1980s witnessed renewed protests in Lhasa, particularly around the Jokhang Temple, Tibet's holiest site. The protests of 1987, 1988, and 1989 were met with harsh crackdowns, including the imposition of martial law in Lhasa from March 1989 to May 1990. These events demonstrated that despite some reforms, fundamental issues between Tibet and China remained unresolved. The 1990s and early 2000s saw continued tensions over issues such as the recognition of the Panchen Lama, the second highest figure in Tibetan Buddhism. When the Dalai Lama recognized 6-year-old Gedhun Choki Nyima as the 11th Panchen Lama in 1995, Chinese authorities detained the boy and his family, installing their own candidate instead. This period also witnessed the globalization of the Tibet issue, with the Dalai Lama becoming an internationally recognized figure and Tibet's cause gaining support from celebrities, politicians, and human rights organizations worldwide. However, this international attention did not translate into concrete political changes for Tibet. The most significant challenge to Chinese rule in Tibet since 1959 occurred in March 2008, when protests began in Lhasa on the anniversary of the 1959 uprising. What started as peaceful demonstrations by monks quickly escalated into violent confrontations that spread across the Tibetan plateau, affecting not only the Tibet Autonomous Region but also Tibetan areas in Qinghai, Gansu, and Sichuan provinces. The 2008 uprising was notable for its scale and the participation of young Tibetans, including many born after 1959 who had experienced only Chinese rule. The protests highlighted the persistence of Tibetan identity and grievances despite decades of Chinese control and development programs. The Chinese government's response was swift and harsh, with hundreds of arrests and a significant military presence imposed across Tibetan areas. The aftermath of 2008 saw increased restrictions on Tibetan regions, tighter control over monasteries, and what many observers described as a harder line toward Tibetan culture and religion. The Chinese government launched patriotic education, campaigns in monasteries, and increased surveillance of Tibetan communities. Since 2009, Tibet has witnessed an unprecedented wave of self-immolations by Tibetans, primarily monks and nuns, protesting Chinese rule. Over 150 people have set themselves on fire, making it one of the largest waves of political self-immolation in modern history. These desperate acts highlight the depth of despair and resistance within Tibetan communities. The Chinese government has responded to these challenges with a combination of increased security measures and economic development programs. Massive infrastructure projects, including the Qinghai-Tibet Railway completed in 2006, have connected Tibet more closely to China proper, while also facilitating further Chinese settlement and economic control. Contemporary Tibet faces complex challenges related to modernization, cultural preservation, and political autonomy. While some Tibetans have benefited from economic development and improved living standards, others worry about the loss of traditional culture and the marginalization of Tibetan identity within an increasingly Chinese-dominated society. The Dalai Lama, now in his late 80s, has begun discussing his succession and the future of Tibetan Buddhism. His announcement that he might be the last Dalai Lama, or that his successor might be chosen outside of Chinese control, has created new tensions and uncertainties about Tibet's spiritual and political future. Tibet's history reflects the complex interaction between spiritual tradition and political reality, between preservation and change, between autonomy and integration. From the heights of the Tibetan Empire to the challenges of modern occupation, Tibetan civilization has demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. The question of Tibet's future remains unresolved. While China maintains firm control over the region and continues to develop it economically, the persistence of Tibetan identity and the international attention to Tibet's situation suggests that the Tibet question will likely continue to influence regional and global politics. The Tibetan experience offers insights into broader questions about cultural survival, religious freedom, and the rights of indigenous peoples in an increasingly globalized world. Whether Tibet can maintain its unique identity while adapting to modern realities remains one of the most compelling questions of our time. Given Tibet's complex history of maintaining its unique cultural and religious identity through various political changes and challenges, how do you think the preservation of Tibetan culture and Buddhism might evolve in the 21st century, considering both the diaspora communities and the situation within Tibet itself?
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.